Okay, so picking up where we left off, in the last video, if you recall, Tosh set up this dichotomy between what he calls social memory. Another way to describe social memory is maybe the social or political use of history to justify a political or a social program or something like that, right? There's always a concern with the present and kind of a justification of the present using the past, right? So a dichotomy between social memory and what Tosh identified as historicism, or we might just say the academic approach of history. All right, and I think that this first sentence on page number 13 is important here. Let me read it. In the sense understood by the historicist, then, historical awareness means respecting the autonomy of the past and attempting to reconstruct it in all its strangeness before applying its insights to the present. Now, that autonomy has to do with the three principles that we talked about last time, that the past is a different place, that it has a context that must be understood in order to analyze the specifics of it, specifically the source evidence that comes from the past, and then that history or historical events are part of a process, right? And so reconstructing it in all of its strangeness means to apply those three principles, to let the past speak on its own or for itself before we try to draw any insights about the present, right? This is not to say that the great question of how does the past inform the present is a wrong-headed one. In fact, it's essential to history. But I think that there are a couple different ways to answer that question. One is to do it the way that social memory tends to do, which is to say, oh, well, this is the way things have always been, or the past was, was this way, and therefore we should be more like that, or the past is irrelevant because we've progressed up to this point, and we just need to be concerned with the present, right? Those are all kind of social memory distortions. As opposed to the academic approach or the careful approach of historical inquiry, which would say the past is its own thing. Let me understand that, and in the process of understanding it, I develop skills that are really applicable to a lot of things, to understanding people generally, and then maybe I can draw some insights about the past that help me understand who I am, or that help me understand how we got to where we are today, okay? But respecting the autonomy of the past. So hopefully that makes sense, okay? The next thing that Tosh does, and I kind of already hinted at this in a comment I made just a minute ago, and that is that the social memory tends to distort the past. And Tosh goes through three ways that this happens, okay? And I want to discuss these briefly. You can read into this and try to understand what he means by each of these three distortions. The first of these is what he calls tradition. And quite simply put, this is, the kind of act of saying, well, this is the way things have always been. This is why we are the way we are, because, the people of the past were this way, and that's just come down to us. You may have heard people explain, present circumstances by saying, well, it's just always been that way. That's what we mean by tradition, right? I recall a number of conversations I've had with people who are, drawing really from the conventions of social memory and trying to explain, say, present conflicts. And they'll just say, well, those people have been fighting for, generations, or, since the beginning of time is one of these phrases that often gets used, right? People have done that since the beginning of time, or whatever, okay? Well, that's obviously not verifiable, and it's really not a very responsible way to think about the past, but that's what we mean by tradition, right? This notion that things have always been this way and that they really shouldn't change as a result of that, right? This is a distortion in a number of ways. I mean, if you look carefully, you can see that things have not always been any particular way that we think of, in terms of continuity. Yes, there are continuities, but there are also important changes, and even from generation to generation, we have new conceptions about the way things are, right? This is kind of the lazy way out, to say things have always been this way, right? We have to look carefully, verify things, try to understand things on their own terms, because otherwise it gets distorted. Tradition tends to have sentimental appeal, as Tosh says here, right? But it actually is a wrong-headed approach, and it can be dangerous sometimes, right? Or have catastrophic consequences. He brings up one particular very powerful use of tradition in social memory, and this is in nationalism, okay? Nationalism, by its very nature, tends to say that the people of a nation, or the culture of a nation, the society that is contained within a nation, has certain characteristics that have always been there, right? That this is an essential component. You'll notice the word essentialism at the bottom of page 15 here. And this means that this nation, the people of this nation, are exclusive in the way that they do things. And within the nation, they would say, and those ways of thinking or of acting are better than other nations, or they're at least ours, and this is what we can expect to do, or this is what we should do. Okay, that sense of nationalism can be very exclusive. It can lead to persecution, or it has, I should say, led to persecution of other people. Certainly, nationalism has been definitely in the 20th century, and even more recently, the cause of truly catastrophic wars like the First and the Second World War. Nationalism is a major factor there. This is not to say that nationalism is an inherent evil. It's not necessarily. Identifying with one's nation is not necessarily a bad thing. But when we use distortions of the past to do so, at the very least, that's irresponsible, and at the worst, this can lead to some of the calamities that we've seen. A second distortion of the past is what Tosh calls nostalgia. All right. Nostalgia is the idea that in the past things were better, and we ought to try to get back to that. Okay. And so nostalgia would hold that the movement of time leads to decline rather than to improvement, right? As he says, nostalgia interprets the past, or interprets history, in one direction only, as change for the worse. And there's a lot of the use of this in politics, right? Many politicians will refer to, well, we need to get back to the way things used to be. To cite one very obvious example, the slogan of the U.S. President Donald Trump, right, was "Make America Great Again." The notion is America was great in the past, we're no longer great, we need to get back to the way things were. That's the use of nostalgia. This is not to offer a judgment of Donald Trump or his policies, but because politicians of every stripe use nostalgia in these ways. But things used to be better, right? Now, the problem with this, obviously, is it's not a very accurate way of understanding the past. It holds that everything was better then and nothing is better now. And it tends to exclude anything in the past that was worse, any negative characteristic, right? It tends to sweep that away and assume that everything was better then. And, when that's obviously a problematic approach to understanding the past. There's a lot more to nostalgia than that, but I don't want to belabor this point. Hopefully that's clear. The third distortion that Tosh brings up is progress, and this is really just the opposite of nostalgia. It's to say that everything is better now than it was in the past because we have moved from improvement to improvement to improvement. And, this is the other end of the kind of polarity with nostalgia, right? It's no more accurate, honestly, than nostalgia is, because it does away with anything that is obvious evidence of decline. And it's always used to further some, agenda, some political or social agenda, okay? And so, nostalgia and progress, even though they're polar opposites of each other, they're both used frequently in kind of politics and social memory and things like that to define the past both are in their own ways distortions of this. As Tosh says at the bottom of page 20 here, tradition, nostalgia, and progress provide the basic constituents of social memory. Each answers a deep psychological need for security through seeming to promise no change or change for the better, or an escape into a more congenial past. So the first one is tradition, the second one is progress, the third one is nostalgia. The real objection to them is that as a governing stance, they require a past to conform with a deeply felt and often unacknowledged need. They are about belief, not inquiry. When we think of the past as tradition, or we think of the past as nostalgia, or we think of the past in terms of progress, this is about believing. It's not about inquiring into the past on its own terms and trying to understand people of the past, that is, and respect them for what they believed or what they did, right? It imposes on them a notion of one kind or another that leads to inaccuracy in understanding. And so, where does that leave us then, right? Do we reject social memory entirely? Is this all just for the worse? That this is a common thing in the world, right? We're all familiar, I think, with what Tosh calls social memory. We all certainly participate in this, whether it's kind of in an active role or in a passive role, listening to others use history this way. Well, the goal of this course is to make us responsible inquirers into the past, right? And even this is going to involve, as Tosh says in the middle of the page, or the part that's highlighted, okay, to challenge socially motivated misrepresentations of the past. But I want to be careful with this, right? Social memory, or the use of a political or a social agenda to inquire into the past, is not on its own a bad thing, right? Ronca, to the contrary, historians cannot be entirely objective. There is always a bias of some kind. I talked in the last video about how the interests of the student of history always shape the way that he or she looks into the past, the kind of topics that the student may be interested in, the way that the student interprets the evidence from the past, and in many cases key developments within academic history have arisen from political discourse or social discourse, right? Look at the bottom of page 22 here. Academic historians may distance themselves from the distortions of social memory, but many well-established historical specialisms today have their origin in an explicit political need. One thinks of labor history, women's history, and African history. It is not always possible to distinguish completely between history and social memory, because historians perform some of the tasks of social memory, right? So historians do not silo themselves and remove themselves entirely from the kind of discourse about the past that happens in social memory. It's important to acknowledge that and to interact with it, and to bring these two together in powerful ways. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. We're nearly at the end of the chapter. Hopefully some of that made sense, and this gives you a good start, at least, on learning to inquire historically. We'll have more to say about sources and those sorts of things in the next video as we move on, look at another text. Thanks.